Well, I'm thrilled to see you all come back in the room. I felt like I had to go gather some up. It's reminded me like I was back on campus. I do that to my students. They don't like to come back either. But I was thrilled to see that many of you did come back. We have about 75 minutes today. And the way I plan to use that time is I'm going to give you my worldview as I see it today, predominantly on the economy, but I'm going to touch on other topics. And then I'm going to try to leave 15 minutes for Q&A, which I believe you're allowed to use your app to submit questions. But during the course of my talk, if there's anything that's not clear and you want to ask a question, raise your hand. I think there are some microphones around. They are recording it, so they'll want to come run and give you a mic. But I'm happy to be interrupted. I'd rather you ask a question if it helps you understand the rest of the talk. I don't want to lose you because there was something that could have been clarified. So, with that said, we also are going to be promoting social media, is what I was told here. So this is my Twitter handle. If you're on the app anyway, you're on your phone, you might as well use Twitter. My handle is @Manshuramani, and of course, the event is @MN_Agrigrowth, as well as, I believe, Agrigrowth 16. 2016? 2016. Yes. All right, so with that said, let's begin with a polling question. So, all of you have the app, I believe, on your phone, or there's a website you go to. This is the question I'm asking as your first polling question, which is, what is the most important factor impacting the global economy today? I just want to get a sense as to where all of you in the room are in terms of thinking. I see the votes are coming in. Actually, I think I can vote too. Although that would be rigging the system, I think. I don't want to rig the system. All right, I don't know how long it takes for all of this to get processed, but we'll give it another 5-10 seconds and then call it a result, or maybe even let it keep going while I comment on it. So this is very interesting because I do understand this audience. I would have expected demographics to be a gigantic issue for this audience, because in your world, number of mouths on the planet matters a lot and would affect the global economy as you see it. If I were to ask this set of questions or run this poll with a group of commodity producers, hard commodity mining companies, you would see China at like 50, 60, 70% of the audience would say that's the most important topic. And of course, politics, I think we're in a new era in terms of its importance. So let me now describe the way I see the world. I think there's a couple of trends that drive virtually everything in the world economy today. And so what I want to do is focus on these themes and tell you about all of them. So if we go back to that poll, how would I have answered it? I didn't give you this choice. All of the above. They all are impacting the world economy they're all having a huge impact on the world economy. I think China is technology, demographics, and politics. But let's start with theme number one, which is China's economic slowdown. You heard Carl from CHS talk about how China had dropped to 6.5%. That's part of the story. If you would decompose the Chinese growth story going from 10 to 6.5, you would say, oh, it's still pretty good. But if you decompose it into investment growth versus consumption growth and decompose where the growth is coming from in China, what you found was 8.5 of the 10, 5 years ago China was growing at roughly 10%, 8.5% of that 10 was coming from building stuff in China. And 1.5 was coming from consuming stuff in China. There was, of course, a large portion of the base economy were exports, but they didn't drive the growth. It was consumption and investing. What happened to that consumption is it went from 1.5 up, maybe towards 5, is my guesstimate. And the more interesting story is what happened to the investment side of Chinese growth story. It plunged. It was a bubble that burst, no question. And you're seeing that impact on the commodity markets. So China was consuming 60% of global concrete production at its peak. 60%. Here's an interesting tidbit for you. Between the year 2005 and 2015, China consumed more concrete than the United States, Canada, and Mexico did between the years 1900 and 2000. So over a 100-year window in North America, we did not consume as much as China did in that 10-year window. So they built a lot. And by the way, they've stopped building, or they've overbuilt, and they're slowing down their pace of building. So that's having an impact. One way to see it is in commodity country currencies. So here's a handful of countries that are very dependent on commodities. So South Africa, Australia, Brazil, oops, one disappeared, but Chile, Nigeria. Here's what's happened to their currencies. Oh my God. I think that's Canada that's disappeared. These are major moves for currencies. Major moves. I was just in Nigeria about 3 weeks ago. And when I was there, I was like, wow, the currency's down by half. Except if you go to the black market and actually change dollars to get a real exchange rate, it was down another half. Whoa, big changes. These affect the dynamics of virtually all forms of global trade. This is shifting inflationary pressures, deflationary pressures. This is shifting competitive dynamics towards particular countries. It's frankly hurting those that are US dollar-based, right? Because the dollar strong equals weaker US exports. All right, that's theme one. Theme two, technology and technological innovation. Let's just think about what's happening here. In fact, I'll talk about 3 companies, not just these 2. The world's most valuable transportation company is Uber. They don't own 1 car. The world's most valuable lodging company is Airbnb, if you believe these private market valuations. They don't own 1 hotel. And the world's most valuable media company is Facebook. And they don't, right now, produce any content. Whoa, what's going on? This is a different world. We're producing a lot more with less inputs. We're getting more output. So that problem that Carl mentioned earlier, which I fully agree with, we have too much supply in the world, not enough demand, is being exacerbated by technology. So technological innovation is making that problem worse, not better. And of course, robots in the sphere of global manufacturing, we're now seeing increasing automation in virtually every form of manufacturing. What does that mean for jobs? Fewer of them, period. I think that's happening. Imagine, here's a fact that you will all recognize and appreciate. The most populous profession in the United States, meaning there's more people employed in this profession than in any other profession. Truck driving, 2.2 million truck drivers in the United States. What happens when you get automated or driverless trucks? Where are they going to go? What are those drivers going to do? What's the job for them? Now, historically, technology's evolved slowly, so we've had transitions. Oh, they retired, we didn't get new ones, it was but it's happening rapidly now, and that's very disruptive. And again, this problem that the world economy faces is we have too much supply and not enough demand. And I'm saying in aggregate, so pardon the econo speak for a second, but aggregate supply is high and rising, while aggregate demand is low relative to where it should be, and it's not rising. Again, robotics, technology, et cetera, exacerbating this problem. Theme number 3, which is important, demographics. Well, everyone talks about the world's population's gonna boom. Hold on a second, not in the US, not in China, not in Japan, not in Europe. Those are the 4 largest economies. No population boom there. But we are seeing a population boom elsewhere. And so we've got this demographic barbell. On one end, we'll put Japan, aging rapidly. On the other end, we can put a country like India, which is growing rapidly, adding 60 million people to their population every year at current rates. Workforce is improving or increasing by, I think, more than 1 million a month. The workforce, labor pool. So that's a problem. When you grow that fast, your population, you have to create jobs that fast. Net, you push all those demographic barbells together. What do you see? You see a world that's getting older, number one, but you're also seeing a shifting of where the growth and population growth is happening. So, and this is the age structure of the world, similar dynamics. So what does this all mean? Is this really a horror show that Vikram's talking about? Right? I just told you what China's slowing, putting downward pressure on commodity prices galore across the board. Number two, technology is taking away jobs, increasing supply when we have too much supply, and in fact, hurting the demand story by not providing the jobs that provide the income that create the demand. And thirdly, we've got this demographic situation where the world's largest economies, where all the spending power is, are aging. And the youngest, the fastest growing populations happen to be in different emerging economies. What does that mean? That sounds like a bad combination across the board. Well, let me tell you what I think it means. Number one, deflation. Extra supply, not enough demand, prices fall. That's what happens when you have too much supply and not enough demand. Now, I'm saying in aggregate. I'm not saying that specifically in any one area. You'd obviously have to get more granular and micro with your analysis. But in aggregate, I see deflationary pressures on the world still. By the way, I love this picture. This is a picture of a 6-story rubber ducky that was floating in the Hong Kong harbor, and it actually collapsed and got pierced and started deflating. And a friend of mine took that picture, said, well, we thought you'd like it, the bubble literally bursting and deflating in China. I was like, great, that's perfect. So it's actually a real picture. Yeah. All right, what else does it mean? It means increasing unrest. We're going to see that more and more around the world. You're seeing it almost everywhere, I say. And you're seeing it in the ballot box. But South Africa, I told you I was in Africa a couple of weeks ago. I was in Nigeria and South Africa. In South Africa, and this didn't make the media that you all read, student protests involving tear gas from the riot police, bullets being fired, students being arrested, buses, entire buses in the streets of Johannesburg being burned, looting. This is serious stuff. That's another commodity country. You're going to see that elsewhere as well. And of course, I think all of us can recognize this even here in our own country, given Tuesday's events. But we're seeing more populism and more nationalism. And again, it's not just here. This is a global phenomenon being driven by this increasing inequality and other dynamics. And so it shouldn't surprise you that globalization and trade, that's in retreat. Here are 3 metrics I want you to just pay attention to. Number one, G20 protectionist measures. This is the United States putting a tariff on something or another country imposing or trying to subsidize something for export, dumping, whatever you want to call it, protecting their own producers. 644 actions in 2015. This year looks like it's going to be up. No, data's not in yet. Cross-border lending. How's that for a good sign of global trade, right? So bank here, lending money to a subsidiary of a company there, internal, external, down 9%. And this is on $1 trillion+. Lending is down across. So globalization of finance is in retreat. And then how about foreign direct investment? Companies investing in other countries, down 40% since the pre-crisis peak. I think the data is very clear. Globalization is in retreat. Nationalism's rising. Inequality is rising. This is a really tough economic environment. And that's what I see when I look at the world right now. So I want to hear what you see. So here's the next polling question. Let's see you guys pull out that app, or the website, excuse me. And let's have you express your opinion here on this poll, which is, I believe the global economic outlook is A, positive, I see good times ahead. B, negative, I'm worried about the future. C, neutral, I'm as confused as ever, don't know what to make of it. D, horrible, you just listened to me. Or all of the above / none of the above, so I can't answer this. So we'll see what you come up with here. All right, well, I don't know where the rising debt to asset ratio came from, but it's on there. Feel free to vote for that one. I didn't put that in there. Oh, there you go, someone vote. Now I know the system's rigged. The voting is rigged here, for sure. All right, so what's nice, well, I was gonna say what's nice is you see the positive surging, but we're seeing a pretty balanced view between positive and negative, I would argue. It's also nice to see only 7.5% of you in this room, or, well, the more I talk, 10% of you in this room agree with what I just said and what I just showed you. Because I'm gonna tell you, those 10% in the room are doing exactly what the media wants you to do, paying attention to short-term dynamics. And I think they were relevant. So I just took you down a wild goose chase that was believable. Hopefully, all of you will listen to what I had to say and you thought it was important. And it is important. And you should pay attention to what's happening in the global economy. But if you pay attention to what I just described were the 3 primary trends and themes to worry about, you'll be paralyzed. You won't have your compass to get through any uncertainty. And so instead, what I want you to do is adopt a different perspective. I want to change your time horizon from that of the New York Times editor who's trying to sell a newspaper, or the Newsweek magazine that's trying to sell and scoop a story before it happens. You guys heard about that one, right? They put out an issue on Tuesday morning, Newsweek. The cover story was Madam President. They printed it and distributed it to all the newsstands in America. They said, don't release it till, it's declared. They printed it. So my point is, the media is so short-term focused, so on edge to try to get that next view, that they're gonna mislead you if you pay attention to them. Change your time horizon. We're gonna look a little further. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to think and look at the world differently. So here's a map of the world. You've all seen this map, nothing unusual about this map. This is a map of the world, how you traditionally look at it. It's based on land area. It's not the only way to view the world. Change your figurative lenses or glasses and look at the world differently. Here's how an economist sees the world. Whoa. We all know economists are kind of screwed up in the way they see the world, but here it actually looks weird. The United States is obese. I mean, we already know we're obese, but I'm saying on the map it looks obese. Looks inflated. So does Europe. So does Japan. China we sort of know is big, right? Sort of we expected that. But again, land area is one way to look at the world. Economics is another way to look at the world. And here's a third way to look at the world. Demographics. Number of people. There's 3 different lenses. Here what you see is the United States looks more normal, a little small perhaps. Europe, down to size. India, China, we know are big. But look at Africa. I don't know if you paid attention to Africa on the prior slide. I'm gonna go back to it. Stare at Africa for just one moment. This is how an economist sees Africa. This is how a demographer sees it. Economist, demographer. Economist, demographer. Oh my God. Is that not, that's crazy. Economists literally have trouble seeing Africa as a relevant factor in the world economy because it's so small. Today also happens to be the fastest growing region in the world. So we need to pay attention to that. But here's something you can, for any of you that are writing down, I see a couple of you taking notes. It's a very dicey business I'm in, trying to suggest things about the future, right? So I just try to put caveats and say it's probabilistic, there's a high likelihood, it looks likely, etc. But I'm gonna tell you one sentence right now that I don't mind if you write it down, and you can hold it to me, because I'm gonna say this with 100% certainty. A child born today, I see a couple of you writing down, I'll talk slowly. A child born today, 17 years later, will be 17 years old. You wrote it down? I see a couple of you nodding your head in agreement. Good. Yes. Why do I say that? Because demographics is destiny. It actually is. We can look at today's population, we can look at birth rates, we can look at mortality rates, improvement of mortality rates, et cetera, and we can guess what the future population is going to be. And so when I hear this story of the population boom happening on the planet, 7.8 billion people on the planet today, gonna be 9 point something by the year 2050, potentially 11 by 2100. Where? And now I know Carl earlier hinted at this, but I'm going to be even more specific than the way he was. It's not happening in the United States, the world's largest economy. It's not happening in Europe. It's not happening in Russia. In fact, Putin's accelerating the demise. It's not happening in China. China recognized that their population is going to plateau and shrink at current rates. And so they changed this one-child policy to a two-child policy. It's not happening in Japan. Again, if you were an entrepreneur and you wanted to go into a new line of business, and you said, listen, I'm going to go into, I think the Japanese market's interesting, I want to go into it. I'd say, great, it's a very big economy, there'll be opportunity. And if you told me, yeah, I'm thinking of going into the baby diaper business, I said, well, you know, that's maybe not the right place to do it. You should probably go into the adult diaper business in Japan. Because you get a better growth market in that category. They're not having babies in Japan. And so where's all the growth happening? It's happening almost entirely on, 80% plus is what I mean when I say entirely, in India and Africa. Those are the fastest growing economies in the world today. So we've got a really interesting dynamic brewing. The middle class of the world is about to explode. This is a really positive, big development. The global middle class is going to explode. We've never had an alignment of population boom and economic booms in the same places. And it's lining up in a really positive, great way. And so what is that going to mean? I'm going to talk to you about a couple things that happen when you get a middle class. So you got a middle class consumer, someone that didn't have any money, suddenly has extra money at the end of the month. What are they going to do with it? One thing many of us in this room already know, more money in the pocket, more meat in the mouth. Here's the trajectory. I'm sorry about the chart, it's pretty small, but the data is wonderful. You can see where various countries are in their evolution towards reaching Western diets. And the largest population countries are not up near where they might one day be. So we're seeing a growth in meat demand, and it's related very clearly to incomes. So that probably means higher food prices. Well, higher food prices may generate unrest. We've got a problem of unrest because of economic inequality. What happens when people are not just jealous of what someone else has, but they don't have food to feed their family? It generates unrest. So where in the world are you going to see unrest? Here's an interesting set of data points. I'm going to share, these data points I'm sharing with you right now are for just a handful of countries. It's not a ranking of the most vulnerable, generically, it's big countries. I mean, you can find little small countries that are more vulnerable. But let's take Pakistan. Pakistan at 41%. I know that Pakistan's GDP per capita is roughly $1,400, $1,500. Let's just say it's $1,200 so we can do the math easily for illustration purposes. That's $100 per month that comes into a Pakistani man's family, or comes into his pocket. Out the gate, day one of that month, $40 for food for the month. Done, 40 out the door. The rest of it is spoken for. Shelter, transportation, medicine / healthcare, education fees for children. It's done. There's nothing left over at that level. There's no money left over. Now, in the world I'm seeing with lots of demand, you see food prices rise. Let's just say 25%. Not an unreasonable level when you have 1 billion plus people entering the middle class. 25% rise in food prices, what happens to that Pakistani man's budget? Well, out of the 100 a month, 50 is now going to food. Okay? Where's the new, what are you going to cut the 10 from? Where are you going to get that next 10? Shelter? Leaky roof? You're not going to fix it? Of course you're going to fix it. Transportation? Nope, you're gonna take the bus, that's how you get your income. Your daughter, your Pakistani man's daughter, has got a cough. She's been coughing for a couple days. You gonna take her to the doctor? Absolutely. I don't know one parent that wouldn't. So what's gonna give? My bet is situations like that lead to unrest. Takes to the streets, because it's not a fair gig, not a fair deal. Whereas down here in the United States, of course, predominantly because of our wealth, we spend less on food. We're less vulnerable to food price shocks. 6%, I don't know where that data comes from. My household, it's 100%. My wife shops at a whole paycheck. It all goes out the door every week. But 6%, I guess, is the average for the United States. All right, actually, before I go here. So I did pull a relatively quick one. Now, this audience, you guys are pretty sophisticated, so you probably paid attention and knew where I was going. But I was talking about protein demand, more money, more meat. I didn't say more food, I said more meat. And then moving my hands around, I started talking about food prices. I went from protein to food. How'd I do that? Why? Well, lots of people eat food that's not protein. Not really, and this is why. It's because of the livestock chain. And many of you in this room will understand this, right? So please, those of you that have more knowledge than I do, don't take issue with the numbers. I saw a couple of, they were, by the way, delayed on their way into this room, the pork guys. They were late. I'd mark them down for attendance purposes. But nonetheless, each pound of chicken you eat, 2 pounds of grain go into that chicken. Each pound of pork, everyone takes issue with this, between 3 and 4, let's just say. Between 3 and 4 pounds of grain or feed go into, what's the number? 3, fine, 3, exactly. You work for Tyson's? You don't, okay. Tyson's tells me that they can do it like lower than even that. And I say, I just don't see it, but okay. And then of course beef, we all know, 8-ish. I'm gonna say ish, because it's in that order of magnitude. And so what we see is this exponential increase in the demand that's going to be coming to the grain complex and spreading generally through food prices. Why? Here's the best visual image I can give you. Imagine a table of 4, a family of 4 in China sitting down. They have no extra money in their pocket. They got 4 bowls of rice. They got a little extra money. Well, let's put some chicken on that rice. Think of it this way. Think of it as 3 bowls of rice now in front of each person. Just went from 4 up to 12 bowls of rice on the table. Then they go from chicken to pork. Oh, you know what? Now it's, well, I'm gonna use the 4, but you can take issue with it. The point still holds. Now you have 5 bowls of rice in front of each single person. 4 for the pork, 1 for the rice. Now you got 20 bowls of rice getting consumed by that same family of 4. And then, of course, you go to beef. You got 9 bowls of rice in front of each person. 4 people, 36 bowls of rice, where you had started that value chain at 4. So that's gonna go up. So we know that the grains, well, as I told you, the animal has to eat something, eats the grains, but what do the grains have to eat? They gotta eat fertilizer, water, sunlight, all sorts of other things that many of you in this room understand better than I do. But I'm not a farmer. I study the industry and I look at it, but I look at it from 30,000 feet. And this is a stunning fact to me when I look at that level of generalization. Within the fertilizer complex, there's plenty of nitrogen. There's plenty in this room. I mean, you just need energy to fix it. There's plenty, albeit in 2 concentrated locations, of water-soluble potassium, potash. You can get it in Canada, you can get it over in Russia, Belarus, but it's sort of there. Water-soluble phosphorus scares me. Why? Because yes, there's enough out there right now, but 75% of the proven phosphate rock reserves are held by Morocco. And what that means is that Morocco will have more power in the land of fertilizer, I would therefore argue, and food, than Saudi Arabia or OPEC ever had in the land of oil. Whoa, who's paying attention to Morocco? It's a really scary development. I think it's one worth watching because it's not exactly in a geopolitically stable part of the world. It has a border with Mali, this is where the Arab Spring happened. I mean, this is not a particularly geopolitically stable place. So anyway, that's a country that I need to watch.
Can you imagine, with that worldview, that countries might start acquiring strategic fertilizer reserves? We have strategic petroleum reserves because we felt vulnerable to OPEC and Saudi Arabia. Whoa, hold on. When countries start building strategic fertilizer reserves and word gets out, what do you think other countries will do? Can you create this self-fulfilling dynamic of hoarding very rapidly? Yes, you can. It's possible. All right, so I talked about that with greater depth, the more money, more meat, because I figured that was of greater interest to this audience, but I don't think that's the only thing that you'll see. And I want to emphasize that as we try to connect some dots here and think differently using multiple lenses, we want to look in areas that don't seem obviously relevant to your business, but I think can come back and connect to your worldview. So people will travel more. That means probably more energy consumption, right? Person goes from a bicycle to a moped to a motorcycle to an air-conditioned car. He's not going back. And so what does that ultimately do to energy prices and energy demand? More money, more healthcare. No question in the world. Some of the best data series I've ever seen and analyzed with such amazing consistency is when people get more money in their pocket, they spend more money on healthcare. And it's a natural evolutionary chain. They start off when they're very poor, just emergency healthcare gets paid for. Then you start getting into preventative healthcare. Oh, let's get the vaccine for the children. Eventually, you start getting into lifestyle diseases that you got to manage, or cosmetic and dentistry, et cetera. But it's a very simple trend, and it continues at all levels. When there's more income, there's more healthcare spending. More education. Any single parent of a middle-class family will tell you they will invest whatever they have in their children's future because they want their children to have a better future. They want to build the success they've had and getting to the middle class, help their children get a great education so they can rise even further, move further. So I think that's another great trend that's going to continue for as far as we can see. But what about smartphones? This has a really interesting dynamic. So the world population may rise by about 10% in the next 5 years, let's call it. Demand for smartphones will rise by about 100%. What does it mean if your customers, your competitors globally have information in their pocket on anything? Whoa. It might unlock new forms of competition. It might improve productivity in areas that are currently lagging. You may create all sorts of innovations that come from that dynamic. And how's this for one that I thought just fascinating? In the next 35 years, the planet will produce more cars, double the number of cars than has been produced effectively since the beginning of the automobile industry. We've had 2 billion cars since the automobile industry got up and running. In the next 35 years, we'll produce 4 billion cars. Whoa, that's a big problem, potentially. I hope the Ubers of the world can maybe mitigate some of this by sharing. Maybe you get some driverless and that can be used by multiple, because that's a big problem on so many levels if it happens. All right, so that's the dynamics I see coming out of an exploding middle class. Now, that exploding middle class is not a certainty. I told you, it's a precarious business I'm in of trying to tell you what the future is going to hold. But I think what we can do is we have our compass, a middle class that's going to explode. It's pointing in this direction. We know that's the path we're on. Now, when we take twists and turns and maybe we end up on a different path, what are the road signs we need to watch for? How can we know where we are? But before we do that, I want to talk to you about 2 particular uncertainties that we need to think about. The first is this complication that's happening with demographics. So the UN Population Division puts out these estimates, and they say, hey, we're going to have 9.8 billion people, or whatever it is, by 2050. The assumptions of those projections, if you read them, this is what I do in my free time, so save you the headache of having to do it. The assumptions include a belief that fertility rates will fall as incomes rise. And it's good. There's good reasoning behind it. It's happened basically everywhere in the world. That as families get richer, they have fewer babies. Except it's not happening in Africa. It hasn't happened in Africa. The average woman on the African continent today will have 4.4 children over the course of her life. You need 2.1 to sustain a population. And by the way, if you have that kind of fertility rate, then 18 years later, you're now getting up to effectively 8.8 out of that same original branch of the tree, and it starts compounding very quickly. And it creates some really interesting dynamics. And I'll share one with you. At current trajectories, Nigeria, which is a country roughly the size of Texas, right? So it's not that large. I mean, Texas is big, don't get me wrong. If there's anyone from Texas, I'm not trying to offend. Texas, a country that size, that's about what Nigeria is. Nigeria, if you extrapolate what's happening there now, by the year 2100, we'll have 1 billion people in a country the size of Texas. 1 billion people. Whoa. So the real question is, why are the fertility rates not falling? One explanation might be there's not appropriate education. Maybe there's not appropriate women's health education. Maybe there's not appropriate access to contraceptives. Maybe there's religious reasons. I don't know. But what I can tell you is it's worth watching, because the needle-moving impact of this particular dynamic may mean that the UN population division numbers are way off. Meaning 9.8 billion, not by 2050, by 2035. 11 billion, not by, and this is bullish or on the demand side for food, because there'll be more mouths, but you might have to change every assumption we have when it comes to population. So it's worth watching. All right, I know there's some entrepreneurial-minded individuals here in the room. So let me suggest this. This is a JV opportunity. We know that more money results in more meat. It's seen globally. It happens everywhere. There hasn't been a problem. It's a good, predictable, bankable trend. We also know that Western diets produce Western diseases, right? So more meat, you tend to get more Western diseases. They're associated. And so you can imagine that there could be a JV partnership between a company like Tyson's, I'm using that just because they're big and they're not in the room, I don't think, and Pfizer, and have a JV. Here's some beef, have some Lipitor. It's the same underlying driver, right? Why wouldn't we do that? All right, I'm saying it in jest, but actually it's pointing, what I'm suggesting is there are some feedback loops here, right? So more money, more healthcare. More money, more meat. More meat, more healthcare. More healthcare, you sort of go in a cycle, and it can potentially get more extreme than even I'm suggesting. All right, so what do we need to watch? I told you this is the trajectory I see. That's the destination I see on the map, and yet we're on this road. What are the road signs that may say you're on a different you're heading to a different destination? How can I keep you informed so that after this conversation we're having right now, or my talk and some questions later, that you can be empowered after leaving this room today to keep track of this thesis, watch it, monitor it, and adjust it to be real-time your thesis. You got to connect these dots, so let's share some of the dots that I think you should watch. Number one, will growth continue? I'm talking about the middle class expanding and growth continuing. That's a basic assumption that we may have to call into doubt. So one of the things I do to watch growth rates when they're about to plunge is I pay attention to something that very few people connect the dots, but I've used it as a bubble indicator, but it also tends to telegraph rapid deceleration of growth. The world's tallest skyscrapers tend to tell you where there's a bubble about to burst or an economy that's overheating and about to slow. You might not believe me. The world's tallest skyscraper, how does that say anything? Well, there's 3 reasons. Number one, they tend to be built with borrowed money, so it's a sign of bank confidence, if you will. So that's number one. There's easy money conditions. Banks lend money. They're never built with 100% equity. Number two, they're signs of overconfidence and hubris, right? We don't need the world's tallest tower. The really tall towers, I mean, it's not rational at some level, and I'll come back to why. And then number 3, they're all speculative. It's build it, hopefully the tenants will come. No one builds the world's tallest tower suggesting that they're going to occupy it themselves. And so for these reasons, it tends to work. Now, why did I say it's sort of a sign of hubris or overconfidence? Has anyone been to the top of the Burj Dubai, now labeled the Burj Khalifa? Okay, well, it's in Dubai, world's tallest tower right now. And if you get up there and you look out, what you see is desert followed by water. If you go down 50 floors lower, what you see is desert followed by water. If you're going to build the world's tallest tower, put it where you can see something. I mean, this is insane. This is literally, they want the mantle. They want to just, all right, we got it. Another point of irrationality. The tower is so tall that if you mistime the elevators perfectly, and this is anecdotal, so bear with me, that if you're up at the top, you push the down elevator button, and the elevator is as far away from you as possible and stops on every floor, and then you get in it, and then it stops on every floor. You land at an elevator bank where you have to change elevators, so you go to another bank. Same thing happens, you push the down button, it's as far away from you, stops, you get in, stops. Then you land in one of the world's largest malls. You have to walk through that. That when you finally get to the surface of the earth, that commute could take you up to 40 minutes. So that's not rational. So I think there's a lot of hubris and chest thumping behavior. So now, does the indicator work? Forget about the theories. I got nice theories, but the practicality is you want to know if you see someone building the world's tallest skyscraper, whether you should be worried. And I'm telling you, you should. Here's why. 1929, we had 3 towers compete for the world's tallest tower status. 40 Wall Street, the Chrysler Building, and then we had the Empire State Building, we had the Great Depression. The next time we had the world's tallest tower built was 73 and 74 with the Sears Tower and the World Trade Center, and we had a decade of stagflation and real downside in economic growth. 1997, the world's tallest tower status moved to Asia, in Malaysia, with the Petronas Towers in 1997, right before the Asian financial crisis hit. 1999, we built the world's tallest tower, or started building the world's tallest tower in Taipei, home of the hardware side of the tech boom, semiconductor capital of the world. Taipei 101 took the title. And then in 2007, within weeks of global equity markets peaking, the Burj Dubai, not even complete, took the title. Shortly thereafter, we had the global financial crisis. So I'm pretty convinced this tells you something. So all of you are out there listening to me and saying, well, that's great, Vikram, but that's a history lesson. How do I use this today? So here's a website which, all joking aside, I do think you want to write down. And so it's called skyscraperpage.com. This is a website that tracks not only where the world's tallest towers are today, but where they will be in the future, based on building plans. This is a great risk management tool. And yet nobody uses it. I use it. You can look and see where's the next tall. And so what do you see? Right now what you see, and this scares me, is that Saudi Arabia is going to take the title. They're building a 1-kilometer high tower in Jeddah right now. It's being constructed. Cranes are there. It's going up. Might that be a telltale sign of energy market chaos, further coming from greater global instability coming out of the Middle East? Might it mean the Saudi system is sort of vulnerable? A lot of question marks here. All right, so that's growth. Number 2, will Indians consume meat? I just told you that we'd have 1 billion+ people entering the middle class. Well, a lot of them are going to be in India. And the Indians are predisposed against meat. So will they consume meat? I don't think that's the right question. The question should be, how much meat will they consume? Because they're definitely going to consume meat. 20% of India is not Hindu. India is the 3rd largest Muslim nation on the planet, with more Muslims than any Middle Eastern country. The only countries they're behind are Pakistan and Indonesia. And so I think they're going to consume meat. The question is how much. But it's worth watching. You may open up the newspaper, as I did earlier this year, and you see, oh, Prime Minister Modi bans beef slaughtering in a province. Huh? What's going on? The newspapers described it as a nationalist thing. Oh, because those were, the Hindus were in control, the Muslims were the beef sellers, and so, okay, maybe. But maybe there's something else going on. Maybe it has to do with demand. Maybe there's too much demand, and they don't want them to make the money, and they want to make the money. They want to sort of channel it to other forms of protein. So it's worth watching. And so I think these are the types of data points you have to pay attention to. Traceability. This is a trend that's coming to food. It's coming. It's absolutely coming. You can see it in almost all walks of life. People want to know, what are the ingredients? Where were they sourced? And so having full value chains for food. Listening to CHS and Carl earlier talking about that whole value chain, I was pretty impressed. I said, that's exactly where I think this industry needs to go. The whole value chain needs to be under one roof, or at least controlled, monitored, managed, watched. Now, what does that do to the relative supply demand for those products that are traceable versus those that are not traceable? So we may be in an environment of excess supply generically, but we may be in a situation of too much demand, not enough supply with traceable products. Oh, now we can decompose it and actually pay attention to what matters to us. This is one of my favorite pictures. These are two salmon. Same exact age to the day. The one behind is genetically modified. It's had a Chinook salmon gene spliced into a coho salmon. They've been fed at normal feeding rates, etc., and you can see what the difference in body mass or biomass is. Same age. Okay. If we see this kind of technological advance, by the way, there's a company publicly traded and based in Waltham, Massachusetts, not far from where I live, listed in London, that got a patent on this and got FDA approval to sell it in the United States. Then it got sort of derailed. There was some protests, and so it stopped, and it's currently unclear. But the name of the company is Aqua Bounty. It's worth watching, because that can totally change the whole global long-term story I was just talking to you about. If we can suddenly get a lot more protein with less inputs, maybe this story I have is wrong. Maybe it's not going to come together the way I thought. And then, of course, we have what's happening in alternative energy, where, here in Nevada, the Ivanpah development, you have all of these. There's not one solar cell involved here. These are all computer-controlled programmable mirrors that change exactly with the sun and point the reflection, or bounce the sun's rays onto that central glass tower, generating steam and electricity by turning a turbine, and it powers 60,000 homes in Southern California for each of these glass towers. It's pretty impressive. What does that do to the energy demand as you have a middle class and you can start doing things like that? So I was telling this story to one of my students, real wise ass, by the way, this one kid, but I'll share with you why. He says to me, Vikram, you've labeled the slide wrong. I said, excuse me? It's an alternative energy slide. I'm talking about solar. He says, no, I'm sure you think that. I was like, oh, please do tell. Yale students are smart. Teach me. He says, well, if you pay attention to what the National Resource Defense Council has been saying, and some other environmental studies that have been taking place of this development, what you can find is that the rays create such heat right near the glass tower that when birds go near there, they cook. This is a fried chicken slide. I said, you get an A for creativity, and I'm going to label it such because I agree that it's worth noting and sharing with audience, and I'll tell every audience every time I use a slide, that's your story. So there you go. I've done my duty. All right, let's keep going here. We've got 10 minutes before Q&A. All right. Population boom I talked to you about in Nigeria, India. We still have population growing all through Southeast Asia, etc. And there's a fundamental difference between growth rates, the headline numbers you see inside the papers that get put up. India, fastest growing GDP of any large country today, 7%. Yeah, but hold on a second. Every single piece of analysis I gave you on more money, more meat, more money, more movement, more money, more education, more healthcare, more smartphones, more cars, etc., was based on more money per person, not in an economy. And what happens if you grow your denominator faster than you grow your numerator? Your GDP per capita can fall while your country grows. Oh my God, that's a tough dynamic to watch, particularly in a country like Nigeria, where I told you they're going to be having 1 billion people. Well, if the population's growing at 2.5% a year, you better hope your economy grows faster than that. Let's take Nigeria as an example. Again, just because I've got the current data for you, I was just there. Nigeria is expected to shrink 1.8% next year, while their population grows. Uh-oh, what happens to per capita GDP? Plunges. Maybe all of this is a race between economics and demographics, and we have to see which one wins. But at least it's a framework to help you think about this, because I don't know the answer. Right now, India's growing much faster than their population's growing. It's growing, income at 7%-ish a year, and population's growing 1-ish, 1.5%. Now, granted, big numbers, but still. Here's an interesting data point. Per hour. So I've been talking to you for almost an hour. Between Nigeria and India, 2,300 people have entered this, or joined us on this planet. In this hour, since I started talking. That's a big number. It's a big number. Now, technically, it's not these numbers. This is taking a 25 prediction and then bringing it back, dividing by hours, minutes, et cetera, to get to where you want. So I think it accelerates over time. I've just taken the simple average. So for any serious econometrician types out there in the audience, or someone who wants to check my math, it's not going to come out exactly right. Productivity. What happens if you get agricultural productivity going through the roof? Uh-oh. Everyone says that's a good thing. No, I just told you have too much supply, not enough demand. And when you have too much supply and not enough demand and you have productivity, productivity is more output with less inputs. That's almost the definition of productivity. I can produce more with less. Except the less is your ultimate source of demand. Uh-oh. So everyone's focused on we're going to grow productivity. It makes sense for each individual person to try to grow productivity. That's assuming the pie is not growing as rapidly as you're growing productivity or more rapidly. So you get a confusing dynamic here, but you got to watch it again. All right, so what does this all mean? I want to wrap this up so we can turn to some Q&A. This is a crazy world we're in. I'm going to connect the dots to the short term and the long term and what it means, hopefully, for you. Number one, deflationary pressures, slower growth, too much supply, not enough demand, increasing technological innovation equals a recipe for currency wars. Countries are competing on their currencies. They want to make them cheaper relative to the dollar, relative to each other, et cetera, to improve the viability of their demand story. Right? Everyone's looking at what's the demand for my goods overseas, not in aggregate. And so when you see a world where there's too much supply and not enough demand, you want to increase the demand for your products overseas, and the way you do that is bring your currency down. Make sure your goods look cheaper overseas. And so currency wars are in full-fledged happening, I would argue. Well, what does the Fed do? This is a question everyone seems to care about, because it's going to affect the dollar. Here's a couple of simple data points which get lost in all the noise about, oh, there's this dynamic, that dynamic. Number one, unemployment's at 5% in the United States. And number two, the core CPI, which is their one measure of inflation, is north of the range that the Fed says that they want to keep it in. That's just a fact. I don't know how there could be any debate about the Fed raising rates in light of these facts. Right? Because also you have household income up 5% year over year. Uh-oh. Now we got income, wages, and prices all going in the same direction. And I can tell you, because I've studied with a bunch of central bankers and spent enough time with them to know that there's one real deep-seated fear that keeps most central bankers awake at night. And it's the fear of a wage price spiral. Because the fear is that suddenly wages go up people buy more goods, prices go up, they then get pissed off that they didn't get a big enough raise, so they ask for bigger wages, higher wages, more prices, and that's how you create out of control inflation, which they don't want. So I say it's probably a no-brainer based on the data I see. Maybe there's other data. But the data I see, when you simplify it, the Fed has to raise rates sometime soon, probably in December, and then they'll pause and see how the next data sets come out. But at least now you know the data to look at. Pretty simple. You can look at 3 measures: income, CPI, and unemployment. That's it. Look at those 3. You don't need to get lost in all the other metrics people are throwing at you in the news. Those are the 3 that'll affect. And by the way, when you raise rates, what do you think is going to happen to the dollar? Relatively speaking, it's going to go up. It's more attractive to put money here. Money comes here. Dollar value rises. All right, let's try to connect the dots to what it means for you. Strong US dollar, implication, weak Brazilian real. Weak Brazilian real equals stronger Brazil export market, equals a more intense competitor. Just saying what I see. It's conceivable I'm wrong. Maybe something else happens that leads it into a different way. Maybe Brazil finds they have out of control inflation. They got to keep raising interest rates higher and higher, higher, chokes off their economy, brings currency flows into their country. Their currency appreciates relative to the dollar. Dollar's already appreciated a lot. Maybe I'm dead wrong, but it's worth looking at. And then, in terms of paying attention to China, lots of people have asked me about the TPP, which that's a political call, and I'm not about to go into that. I'm not going into that minefield, not yet. But what I can tell you is that China, as this TPP was coming together, changed the direction of their focus. They had been focusing this way towards the United States and the Western world, and what they did was they turned around and said, we're going to face this way. They're facing west. They're building out, as part of a new economic development program. This is something that's gotten not nearly enough attention here in the Western world. They have a program called the One Belt, One Road plan to rebuild the Silk Road. And they're going to spend already allocated $1 trillion to build ports, rails, airports, highways, bridges, tunnels, connecting Beijing and East China through West China, down into the Middle East, through Central Asia, into Africa, and up into Europe. They're building it now. They've allocated $1 trillion towards that. Whoa, well, hold on. That may generate an interesting dynamic in terms of global demand, could spur a new commodity boom. That commodity boom could, in fact, spur countries like Australia, Brazil, Canada, South Africa, other commodity countries to have stronger currencies as they suddenly have a great economic trajectory on their hands. And that could turn around and make the US dollar get weaker. Worth thinking about. I'm giving you a very complex sort of worldview because I think it is complex. But you can isolate each of these things, pay attention to them, interpret them when they come out, and you'll have a better way to navigate this uncertainty. Here's one more. What happened with the Russian sanctions? Russian sanctions, we put up sanctions on Russia. Russia turns around and smacks sanctions on the United States and the Western world, saying, fine, you're not going to send your goods here. We're not going to let you send your goods to our markets. So let's just focus on the salmon market, which at the time I was studying. Turns out Norway, one of their largest export markets for salmon was to Russia. And so what ended up happening was salmon prices plunged overnight. Big market evaporates, extra supply, not enough demand. Uh-oh, looks like a horrible outlook. But the Russians still wanted salmon. And there were some Chilean entrepreneurs that were, Chile is the second largest salmon producer in the world. They said, well, hold on, we'll ship to Russia. They had previously been shipping to the US. Wait, so now they start shipping over to Russia, and now there's a shortage of salmon in the United States, which the Norwegians were able to fill. Salmon prices are hitting all new highs. They started hitting highs after 6 months after you would have thought by predicting and by only looking at that one step and not looking further into the logic of what could transpire, you would have gotten it completely wrong. You would have thought salmon prices are going down when they went way up. They're at record prices today. And of course, immigration policies will affect a lot of these stories. And we have a big unknown, I think, is the way I would describe it, with immigration policy reform in the United States. Again, I'm happy to take questions on it, but I prepared this slide before the election. Climate change. We've got to pay attention to what's happening there. Why? Very simply. Rising temperatures, falling yields. Pretty good ratio. We know it. It varies from 6 to 10% for each degree, depending upon the crop, based on the data I've looked at. 1 degree rise, 6% drop in, I think, wheat yields. 1% rise, 10% drop in corn yields, I think, et cetera. All else being equal, which rarely are all things equal. So it's got the very direct ability to impact your world. Of course, policy on renewable fuels is another big thing. What happens there? Real big question mark for the demand side. And again, imagine for a moment that if policy shifted away from renewable fuels and suddenly you had a lot more supply, given the current dynamic of too much supply, not enough demand, you took away some of the demand, you'd have even less demand. Real problem. We've got to watch this policy. All right, so let me wrap up since the timer is now at 0 and give you some time for Q&A. This is a crazy world we're in. Look, I will tell you, this is as mind-numbingly complex as any global economic environment, I think, in the history of what we've seen. It's a really tough world to navigate. So how do you do it? There's one way. You can stick your head down in the sand like this ostrich and not try to pay attention, just hope it passes. That may actually serve you well, in light of if the alternative is pay attention to the news headlines. The other way is to take a step back and connect the dots. Take a bigger picture view, look at the whole, look at what's happening over here, connect it to what's happening over here, look at here, connect it there, and say, whoa, I've got my compass. I know we're heading there. Let me now get the road signs clear so that when we move a little bit, I know whether we're going slightly off path or whether we've gone onto a different path. Is this just a detour around going to the same destination, or are we going to a different destination? And you can only see that if you have A, compass with a direction that you think you're going, and B, an understanding of all the road signs, which are probably not even in your normal sphere of where you pay attention. So you have to look broadly. And the best analogy I have for you is you got to think like a fox. Because, 2,500 years ago, there was a Greek poet, Archilochus, for those who care, who said, there's a difference between hedgehogs and fox. The hedgehog knows one big thing, while a fox knows many little things. Well, my view is a hedgehog is an expert, a specialist, a narrow, a deeply focused individual. And a fox is one who knows a lot about what's going on all over the place. And what it means is you got to use multiple lenses. I showed you a demography lens, an economic lens, a land area lens. There's different ways to view the world. Look at them. And think about them consciously. Connect the dots. Don't worry about generating them. All these dots I gave you were from publicly available sources. I don't have any proprietary data. I was just looking at what's out there. You see this also. You got to triangulate. Don't believe any one data point. Might be wrong. See validation from multiple data points. And you got to think about different scenarios, like I said. So I gave you one scenario about what happens, but then I tried to suggest, what happens if Indians don't consume meat? Maybe that's a different scenario. And you got to think about the ramifications of what happens. So with that said, I think it's time to view the world differently. Especially this week, there's different ways to think of the world. One, you can think like, oh my God, this is a threatening environment, it's horrible, it's awful. I'm going to be locally oriented, short-term, defensively postured. And why wouldn't you? It takes a little more courage to be more opportunity-oriented and to think about the future, where the demand's going to be. Think about the world, not just the local environment. And think about growth. Think about the possibilities, because there are a ton of them out there. And so I want to leave you with that. And we're going to leave you with one last polling question before I give you my contact info. So take out that little app or the website on your phone. And so summarize for me what you felt this hour was. Either A, an hour of economic babble that maybe made some sense. Number 2, that left you more confused than you were before you walked into the room. An hour of your life that you will never get. That will hurt. Ouch. Well, maybe. I hope not too many people, but if it's true, I want to hear it. or that felt like an intellectual root canal, so I hope I didn't stress you out too much by trying to connect these dots, or which empowered you to navigate uncertainty. So go ahead and vote, and we'll see the results here. The good part's falling at an alarming rate. Oh my goodness. Okay, this is one I really should vote in. Rig the system. All right, well, good. It looks like a lot of you found some value in this process, so I appreciate that. And for those of you that found a little babbly, I would encourage you actually I'll leave you contact information here. Let's go off this slide. Uh-oh. Oops, sorry. Can we just get that last slide with my contact information up? Because if you want a copy of the presentation, as soon as we get it, for legal reasons, I can't broadcast it, but I can send it to anyone who emails my assistant. So just send an email requesting it. It's to support, SUPPORT, at my last name, mansuramani.com. support@mansuramani.com. Oh, here we got it. So this is my contact information, and there's this, the support at Mansuramani. If you send a quick email saying, I'd like the presentation, we'll have to PDF it, shrink it, compress it, send it, which we're happy to do. Or you can follow me on LinkedIn for more data. For those of you that talked about economic babble, there's lots more articles, a little more depth on different topics. And of course, feel free to follow me in any other way. All right, so we have time for 2 questions is what I've been told. And let's see what the questions are. I'll get the questions down here. Oops. No. All right, I'm going to go right off the top because it looks like there's a bunch here. So how will political unrest limit your theories about Africa? Mr. Casal mentioned this could be a very long time. Yes, I think the African story is one where rule of law is coming into place in different ways in different times. Zimbabwe, for instance, used to be one of the world's most promising agricultural stories, and Robert Mugabe came into office, and suddenly, over the last 30 years, it's turned into an economic implosion that had hyperinflation, et cetera. He's 93 years old. He won't be here forever. And there's amazingly productive agricultural land. There's decent rule of law, decent institute. That's just one country. You can't generalize on Africa as a whole. It's 53, 54 countries, depending upon who you talk to. And so I think, yes, the general rule of Africa turning into be self-sufficient anytime soon is probably good enough to think about that there's no way they can get self-sufficient anytime soon. But with that said, lots of wastage occurs in Africa because they don't have refrigerated infrastructure that can be built quickly. They don't have appropriate logistics, information, and transportation networks that can get built quickly. Some places they don't have paved roads, so how do you expect goods to get back and forth? You pave a road, suddenly you reduce the friction cost, you reduce the wastage. So yes, it'll take a long time. I don't know if it'll take as long as he suggested. All right, you mentioned climate change and a reduction in yield. However, part of climate change is greater greenhouse gases. Might higher levels of carbon actually increase productivity? So I wrote about this at one point, and the answer is yes, in certain areas, at certain times, it will. There's an offset, of course, with temperature. And so temperature versus carbon in different plants and different conditions, there's really no generic answer to that question. It's a valuable question to suggest, or it's an important question to say, hold on a sec, carbon dioxide, plants need carbon dioxide, won't you get a yield bump because higher carbon dioxide? Is that a question?
Yeah.
Okay, so fine, go ahead.
Thank you. I have a question about ethanol. And when the Renewable Fuel Standard passed about a decade ago, it drove a lot of food inflation and a lot of that instability, like your example in Pakistan. It also linked the U.S. egg market with the energy market. And Saudi Arabia is the main cornerstone of the energy market. They're now on track to build a really big skyscraper. Is that a bad omen for our ethanol industry and our biofuels?
Yeah, look, I'm worried about the energy market. I think, well, the main source of my worry comes from a belief that Saudi Arabia is a candidate for a total economic and political implosion. I think that's a possibility, and here's why. I didn't want to end on a depressing note, but I think this is too important for you not to think about. Saudi Arabia is trying to transition off of oil towards another economy. They have this Saudi Vision 2030. I wrote a piece about this, by the way, that got a lot of traction. It's called Saudi Arabia on the Brink. You can find it on LinkedIn and other places. But I'd encourage you to read it, because I think it lays out a couple of really important points. They're trying to transition away from oil. Number two, they have raised the entitlements so high over the past few years, basically since the Arab Spring, that they now require $100-ish roughly oil to break even on the government budget. That means Saudi Arabia, which everyone thinks has piles and piles of cash, at current expenditure rates, barring an improvement in oil prices, they'll run out of that cash in 4 to 5 years. Saudi Arabia, the country that had piles of cash, going bankrupt. Does it surprise you then that they just issued some bonds? So now when you're reading the newspaper, you see, oh, Saudi Arabia issues bonds. You're like, huh? Rich country issuing bonds? What do they see in the future that I don't? Right? So that's what. Secondly, unemployment in Saudi Arabia is 25, 27%. Young males, doesn't make me feel good. Maybe it makes me paranoid in some way, but I do worry about unrest inside the kingdom. And I think the kingdom is temporarily focused externally. They're not even aware of the unrest that's brewing domestically. I mean, they are aware. I'm exaggerating. They, of course, are aware. But they're paying more attention to what's happening in Iran and the potential threat outside. They're running a war, which they've never had going on ever in Yemen. Their military budget is the 3rd largest in the world. 3rd largest in the world. Their military budget is bigger than Russia's. It's the United States at 600 billion, China at 150, and then Saudi Arabia. It's the highest as a percentage of GDP for any country in the world. Okay, so they've got something, some fear, some existential risk threat thing going on. And their economy's imploding while they're worried and spending more on things outside. Now, I will tell you, the Middle East instability, if it spreads from more than Syria into Saudi Arabia and you get this implosion and you get more unrest, that probably means more refugees going into Europe. That probably accelerates the demise of the European Union. That probably means, look, we had 1 million refugees showed up in Europe in 2015, and you saw what happened. It led to Brexit, led to other things, right? Now, you get more refugees showing up again, which they've slowed this year in 16, but what if it re-accelerates because of the scenario I'm painting to you? I tell you, I would put money on the fact Europe will not exist. You will not go in the direction of the United States of Europe. You will instead go back to individual countries. You will get massive currencies, sort of manipulation that takes place on that initial movement, and you'll have a really chaotic economy that will put downward pressure on global growth and global demand. So I didn't want to end on that sad note or that depressing a note, but I do think we're out of time. I'd encourage you to read more on my website on all these topics, but thank you very much.